All right, welcome back to Hiking with Anderson. And again, we're joined by the famous philosopher Michael Plato. And we're going to talk, we're actually in a park called Settlers Park. And that sounds like a perfect setting to discuss post-colonialism. So we're gonna figure out how that fits into critical theory. What's the relationship between post-colonialism and critical theory? What is it?
Well, post-colonialism, I think you could say, is, as with many of these different schools or approaches or methodologies that have developed, it's one of those ones that we certainly see has developed over the last few decades that certainly is trying to explain a lot of what's going on in the world or the way the world is, but also has something of an activist component or a progressivist component, something that's trying to alter.
Try to agitate for change.
It can be, yeah. It can be It can be in a very activist way, or it can be in a more muted sort of way. And I'll sort of explain when I think of like with post-colonialism. So post-colonialism is a school that very briefly and very roughly it recognizes that, and I think as all of us do, that there was a period, especially the 19th and early 20th century, of colonialism. Where you had especially the European powers, the British, the French, the Germans, even one could make arguments for America of having
colonial powers.
The colonial powers who divvied up and took over large swaths of the world, Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the like. That's sort of understood, and the idea is, well, of course, now those powers have really kind of diminished. They're back to being European
Probably,
states.
If you had to give a good date to it, it would be end of World War II.
Yeah,
everything collapses.
Everything really collapses over the next couple of decades. There's sort of like it tends to be a much more benevolent release of things, especially after India in 1948 separates.
It seems like the world wars were a suicide wars of Europe, right?
Yes.
They destroyed themselves. They sucked a lot of the rest of the world into it.
Yeah.
And then people are looking back saying, why were we connected to them?
The Europeans were so engaged in that war, any kind of military support that they would have had probably would have been pulled from those colonial states. And so everybody recognizes that that's over and done with. Colonialism for its goods and ills or whatever is now done. Post-colonialism argues, however, that the effects, the repercussions, especially the psychological and sociological effects of colonialism are still residual, especially in the cultures of these countries, these formerly colonized cultures.
So there it becomes not so much just a temporal or historical designation, like we're after colonial powers. It becomes another one of the Marxist schools of thought.
Yes, I think you could put it. You could broadly put it in post-colonialism. I'd be very careful with that. Post-colonialists can certainly draw from Marxist thought, and a lot of them will. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
But a lot of their ideas really were sort of very interesting and novel in their way. So just give you a little bit of background on some of the key names and we'll actually make it very simple. 3 names and 3 concepts we'll talk about today. Just very short video.
Yeah, that's good. 3 names, 3 concepts.
3 names, 3 concepts we're going to talk about. The first is Edward Said, who was a Palestinian-American theorist. He developed an idea that we're going to be looking at called Orientalism in a moment. And then we have another figure, a Kenyan by the name of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is another theorist. And then the third one is a British Indian thinker by the name of Homi Bhabha. So we often refer to them Said, Ngugi, and Homi Bhabha are sort of the 3 thinkers, and their ideas are going to be very influential. And they end up developing a number of key ideas. The first one is called Orientalism, and it's actually from a book that Edward Said wrote called Orientalism. And he basically makes the argument in this book that the West sort of has obviously, a sense of its own superiority in a way. And one of the ways it solidifies that superiority is by exoticizing other cultures, especially Middle Eastern or Eastern cultures. And you can kind of sort of see this on the one hand, and so on the one hand, it's sort of like, well, look at those people over there. They're very sensual and barbarous, and this becomes a thing.
That's where it sort of otherizes them.
It otherizes
and
them.
dehumanizes them.
Yeah, it is a dehumanizing. It's a bit of an unfair thing, but it's a very unfair thing in a lot of ways, because it's just like these people, they're more exotic. They may be more sexually promiscuous. They're much more immoral. They're much more violent. I mean, we sort of see that today. You know, there's sort of the Western idea of the harem. You know, like, you know, in the East, it's all harems and chopping off heads or something like that. And Said will say, on the one hand, that idea bolsters the European view of like we're the moral, have a sense of moral rectitude and are superior and are civilized as opposed to these people. So on the one hand, that's what it does. The other thing does is you say, well, look at how bad they are. We need to go in and
help
get
them.
them.
Help
take
help
over.
them,
By colonizing them.
What's interesting is you get the sense of self-justification is what I call it.
Yeah.
So I have my own vices, let's say, but I make myself feel better about them by pointing out how bad the other guy is.
Yes.
And so that's what seems to be going on. And then people like say notice that and they say, well, hey, wait a minute, you've got your own problems, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I mean, and so Said really sort of lays that out as sort of really sort of looking at how the West has looked at the world and how that's shaped the power dynamics. Two other ideas that were developed along that are very crucial to post-colonial thoughts. One is called mimicry. And mimicry is the idea that the people, one of the reasons why the peoples in the colonized peoples didn't rebel against the empires was that they ended up were taught and ended up emulating their colonial masters. They take on British customs and British ideas and traditions, Western ideas of beauty, for example, or morality and the like. And so many post-colonialists will say that prevented a lot of people from rising up. But it also creates sort of a dual-mindedness now. People, they're like, well, what am I? Am I African or am I British?
Yeah.
Am I, Vietnamese or French?
There's a problem like self-identity.
Self-identity. It leads
crisis,
to a split sort of sense of self. And this ultimately leads to what Homi Bhabha calls homeliness. Where the idea is it's not that you don't have a home per se, you do have your homeland, but you somehow feel that you don't fit there anymore.
You don't belong anymore.
You don't belong there anymore. I'm not really of this place in any way. And so it creates a sense of split self and dislocation.
Yeah.
And so that's post-colonialism's sort of analysis of the effects of colonialism. I mean, in a few minutes.
Sure.
Whipping it down.
You can see how the use of power to colonize others for goods to then be resold or for work to be labor to be used creates that response, right?
Yep.
Because the question is, what gives the right to the oppressors or the colonizers to do that? What's the basis for their rights of being able to take away this country's freedoms?
Right,
so
right.
The objection is then about how do we...
They're mostly. We're looking at mostly the effects.
Yeah.
What is the idea that they're sort of seeing here? They look at sort of like what are the the Western justifications.
Yeah.
That's certainly one thing, but they're looking at the effects. And the other thing and that's where I was going to lead us to, shall we say, the more activist component is how then do we turn the tide on post-colonialism, or how do we
decolonize?
As we learn. And the decolonizing it is a couple of things. One, the idea is get back to the culture that came before. So, let's try to regain, if you're African, to regain your African roots. If you're Indian, to regain your Indian roots. If you're, Aboriginal Australian, to go back. Now, on the one hand, that's part of the project. The other problem is, of course, they recognize a lot of that could be lost, that culture. Yeah. And secondly, cultures change and move on. So suddenly, are you going to actually say to somebody who was African, by the way, now you got to go back 200 years?
Yeah.
Why? We're in a modern technological world, and so this is where they will start to bring in a lot of other ideas or isms, feminism, Marxism, and the like, to assist in this this decolonizing project. How do we negotiate ourselves and sort of remove the effects, things like mimicry, homeliness, and even Orientalism from it?
Yeah.
Now, for your audience, I would say this leads us to a couple of interesting questions we want to look at, especially if we're coming from a point of view that engages with Western philosophy. One of the arguments that post-colonialism will make implicitly, if not necessarily explicitly, is, well, the Europeans, especially during the time that they came here, was Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, where they had ideas of universal human nature, human values, and these sorts of things. And post-colonialists will say this is actually not universal. These are just European views that they have universalized. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, first of all, are there universal human values?
Yeah.
Is there a universal humanity or humanism that we
'Cause
can't
really-
get, or is it all just a product of our own cultural background? So this is one thing that post-colonialism makes us think about.
Because it's worth adding real quick that
Yeah.
just because someone says something's universal doesn't make it universal.
Yes.
Right. So it's perfectly fair to critique someone who says, here's a universal truth, and you say, no, it isn't. It doesn't follow from that you don't believe in universal truths.
Right.
But that sounds like where we might be going if we're simply going back to traditions, and there's many traditions.
Yes.
Then we don't have the ability from tradition alone to get to that universal truth.
That's right. And so the idea that Europeans had made this claim, and maybe it was a justified thing to say, why do you think you had that truth? Well, but that leads us to our question now: is there universal truth, and how do we attain it?
Yeah.
The second thing then that also we want to consider is if, and this is what post-colonialism, certainly in more recent manifestations of it, I think will say that colonialism is an inherent part of the Western philosophical tradition. That it is, if we're going to decolonize ourselves, this philosophy, this tradition that we have in the West has latent colonial components to it, and that makes it something that we should be avoiding, or at least, maybe not avoiding, at least critiquing, or
whenever you
undercutting
present it, you present it with that.
with that. Yes.
So you would present Aristotle with these components,
Yes.
not just Aristotle's logic by itself,
Yeah.
because it's inherently colonizing. Now, that does make me wonder about part of the Enlightenment development in Europe was recognizing that there's traditions. It came out of the wars of religion.
Yes.
And you realize you have a Roman Catholic, but also a Protestant tradition. And in virtue of appealing to tradition, we can't get to the truth. And there has to be something else that makes it true besides just that it's my tradition. So the Enlightenment was looking to solve that problem. Now, it might have failed. The answer it gave might have been a failure. But we can see that the
enterprise itself
that's a good,
is still...
that seems to be the same one that decolonizing would want to ask as well. Because
I think it
otherwise
does,
you just end up with the many traditions.
Yeah, I mean that becomes that, and I think that's one of the things where you're going to see, again, we're trying to boil down a whole tradition of philosophy, but you will have some that will let's just go to those traditions, and
That's why I mentioned earlier the Marxist connection, not in terms of economics, but in terms of the materialist dialectic.
yes,
Because I think that will keep any thinker caught within the materialist dialectic won't be able to do what I just suggested, because ultimately they don't believe there are universal truths. They're just
it's just
the
power
conflict.
relations.
Yeah, just the power relationships. So you'll lose. But the reason that's bad for those involved in activism is that the activist wants to make appeals to big words like justice and love and truth, and you lose those if you don't have universals.
Right.
And you're no longer able to agitate for change towards justice. You're just agitating for change, and you can't claim, hey, my change is better or worse. It's just change.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? So that's a big problem.
Yeah.
We'd want to make change for the better. So this is what I want to conclude with is this, because a lot of times when I'm teaching, I like to talk about the big questions.
Yes.
And that's one approach to philosophy. You'll get textbooks on the big questions. But one response to decolonize philosophy would be to say, you shouldn't say the big questions, because that implies they're universal. You're imposing them on others. Other people don't actually have those questions or think that they're very important. You need to go around and ask everybody what their questions are. Maybe that's sort of a democratic approach to the big questions. Like, what do you think is important?
I think that's one of those points. Listening to you talking about that. Yeah, that when you bringing it back to those big questions, because that often is not what is looked at.
Yeah.
In these sorts of traditions.
But you know what? That's still true with our students, I bet. When our students come in and we tell them, here's the big questions we're going to study, that, for many of my students, that's the first time they've ever heard of that question. But they quickly relate to it. Because one of them would be this: what makes life meaningful? And so it's a good chance that I have students that have never thought of that.
Yeah.
But as we go over, they start to say, you know what? Yeah, I want a meaningful life. I want to figure out what that is. So the fact that a person hasn't thought of it themselves yet doesn't mean it's not a big question. Like to call something a big question, I actually call them basic questions instead, because they're like the starting point questions.
Right, and then we can start to diverge into all of the
all the particular little questions after that.
Yeah.
But you start
which encompasses 95% of most philosophy. Yeah.
So I wonder about that, if the idea of big questions are imposed questions is itself an example still, it's inescapable, of answering a big question, right? You're still trying to make sense of the world, give meaning to the world, and that's really where it seems like philosophy begins, is with that pursuit and quest for meaning.
And I think, to be fair, I think this is one of the areas, like you said, that could be very helpful in studying world philosophies and many of these other traditions, whether it's African, Chinese, Indian, Arabic philosophy. Are they asking those baseline questions? Are they asking slightly different ones? Are they asking them in the same way, and where do they lead? And I think that's
fascinating.
It is fascinating.
I love doing that.
And I think that's one of those. I think that's one of the things where, it's, like I said, like if we could put it in the post-colonial project, where it is at its best, what can be useful in it is to recognize not that this is. I think that's where the concern that a lot of people have with post-colonialism is, well, we're just going to eliminate or denigrate or dismiss one tradition that we've had, or just sort of seeing as bad. But I think if it's actually like, well, let's actually bring these different traditions into dialogue with one another.
Right.
I think that is actually a very worthwhile project.
I would think so. I would think if any philosophy that doesn't do that is anemic philosophy. You'd have to bring in all the different approaches that humans have tried to these questions in order to examine them yourself.
And this is one of those things about post-colonial thought. I mean, and certainly with this idea of global philosophies that anybody there might want to pursue, maybe graduate work or more advanced level areas of philosophy. There's in the last while, how many more degree theses or dissertation can be done on the categorical imperative or on Descartes? I mean, there's certain, but it's very narrow.
It gets narrow and narrower. Yeah.
It's getting narrower and narrower, and I think being able to bring in those other traditions and compare them. Okay, wait a minute. I've looked at more recently, like for example, the understanding of reason and rationality in India and China. What are those? What does reason and rationality look there compared to what the Greco Western tradition has been?
I think that's very probable. I mean, for me, the idea of analytic philosophy being the pinnacle of all philosophy is just laughable.
Yeah.
So we should be engaged in critically analyzing analytic philosophy itself. And I bring that up because you mentioned Kant. That's one of the two streams from Kant to the present. And the idea that that's all philosophy is figuring out what words mean to different users. That's not philosophy. We need to do much more than that. So I think the whole idea of problematizing that, or I have this picture in my office from Vanity Fair. It's around 1900. It's just titled Oxford Dawn. And it has this guy in his Oxford outfit, and he has a copy of Plato going to class, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea that, no offense to this Plato, but the idea that, Plato somehow is the end-all, be-all of philosophy, we should question that. So,
I do have to recognize my own personal bias when
Michael
coming
Plato
to Plato.
is the end of
of
philosophy.
And just because we haven't talked about it, it is my name, and I don't think it had any connection to me wanting to study philosophy, but there it is. I've had to. It certainly helped in my classes.
Because you have envy students who can say, "Where are you going?" "Oh, I'm going to philosophy class with Plato," and they're telling the truth, right?
That's right.
They are,
because truth matters.
It does. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you
to talk about post-colonialism in Settler Park with Hiking with Anderson. See you next time.